Welcome everyone to the Gender History Research Cluster's Roundtable on Celebration and Belonging in Black History Month. You should have been notified when you entered the meeting Zoom, but this is being recorded, so please keep your microphone off and your camera off if you don't want to feature on the recording. So today's discussion is in part inspired by the conversations that the Gender Cluster hosted last year with Alice Mpofu-Coles and Schmidt Mutswiri, both of whom are kind enough to join us again today. In the second wave of Black Lives Matter protests last summer, Alice and Schmidt shared intimate reflections on belonging as a researcher, forging identity, performative allyship, and the role of universities in bringing about meaningful progress. And this is the conversation that we want to continue today as we look back on the changes of the past year, meanings of the terms diversity, inclusion, and decolonizing the curriculum in practice, and the long-term work to centre Black history within our department. So it's a panel about celebrating Black history and Black historians, but also one that addresses belonging in the context of allyship and the personal experiences of Black research students here at the University of Reading in their own words. So I will just ask our speakers to please briefly introduce themselves, starting with you, please, Alice.
Hi, my name is Alice Mpofu-Coles. I'm a PhD researcher in the Human Geography department, and my research is on identity and transnational activities for young immigrants. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. And Schmidt?
Hi, everyone. My name is Schmidt Mutswiri. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Reading. My research is on nationalism, looking at nationalism from a faith and gender perspective. And I'm happy to join you today. Thank you,
Schmidt. Natalie?
Hi, I'm Natalie Thomlinson. I'm an Associate Professor of Modern British History here in the department. I'm a historian of gender and feminism in modern Britain. And my first book was on debates around race within UK feminism in the 70s and 80s. And I also teach a course called Black Britain here in the department. So I wouldn't necessarily call myself a historian of Black Britain, but some of my work has touched on it and I do teach it to students.
Lovely. Heike?
Hello, so my name is Heike Schmidt. I am an Africanist. I teach and research African history in the 19th and 20th centuries with a focus on Zimbabwe and Tanzania. I have the pleasure to supervise amazing students, some of whom are in this room right now. And yeah, my main approach is gender history and social and cultural history.
Lovely. And Liz?
Hi, I'm Liz Barnes. I'm a historian of African-American women primarily, particularly the transition from slavery to freedom in the mid-19th century South. And within that, I analyse histories of sexual violence, but also of policing and military occupation. And I teach lots of that here in various guises.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So there will be time at the end to ask the panel some questions. So when that time comes, please just raise your Zoom hand, or you can type them in the chat if you prefer, and I'll read them out. But for now, I'd like to start with a question for the wonderful Alice. Alice, you're a researcher of identity, you're also a councillor and elected people's representative, and you're an activist. And it was your paper on belonging in the 1.5 generation that inspired so many people, including us, to explore belonging as this pivotal theme. And in your interview last year, you called on us all to wake up and smell the coffee, and that phrase has really stuck with me. I want to ask you, what, if anything, do you think has been learned and unlearned in this past year? Have you seen any of the changes that were promised following the second wave of Black Lives Matter?
Oh, thank you very much for that question, Chessie. I think I'll start on the perspective of what I do in community engagement, mainly. I do some work within the university called community engagement and trying to harness the community in Reading to be linked with the university as such. So I call the Shinfield Road the Berlin Wall so that it can be dismantled and sort of all the communities are able to engage with the university. It is hard to pinpoint exactly how change can happen within racial belonging. But I think if I come into the other question that you brought up again, which is about that I've been elected as a local councillor, I think in my own way to be thankful of the people of Weekly Ward that they felt that I belong. I've been in this community for over 19 years. I've done a lot of work. I engage with everybody in that, in the whole part of Reading. So trusting the fact that I was elected in a very difficult circumstances after COVID and all that is we know is happening in politics, it means belonging does happen, but it's hard work that you need to ingrain yourself in the community as a Black woman to feel that you belong, and you have to work harder than anybody else. So I've worked hard so much to be this, and I don't think it's all to do with luck, but it has to do with the hard work that you do. So most of the things that come in different perspectives, like in political, where I am, I think it is, you have to work hard. It is a very difficult area to get to this point, and I don't take it lightly because I represent the community. I represent residents of Weekly, and Weekly is a very dynamic ward where it has from one of the deprived areas in some places that are quite middle class. So you have to know how to engage with people on those ones. So that's how I can see the belonging continuation of it happening in that sense. In general. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. I think what you said just then about your responsibility for representation is really important. And that actually brings me on, Natalie, to a question for you about the university, and how does the university take that responsibility for representing the sentiments of Black History Month? We've spoken a lot before about the meanings behind the terms diversity and inclusion. And how meaningful is it to talk about that in practice? And how does the history department specifically support the university's aims in that area, please? Thank you.
It's a really interesting question, and I think it also brings into focus who the university is. Who are we talking about when we talk about the university? Are we talking about students? Are we talking about academic staff? Are we talking about senior management? I think those are three quite distinct groups, often with quite different interests, and interests which sometimes are not always aligned with each other, it may be fair to say. The university has actually, in terms of, I guess, like its most official sort of arm in terms of senior management and what it's doing as a sort of official University of Reading stuff in terms of Black History Month, there has been definitely a move over the last few years to do much more, which is definitely a very welcome development. It was actually a really interesting program that have been put together, I think mostly by some colleagues in the law department. So there's a lot of sort of various talks and lectures going on, and I really encourage people to check out the program for that. In terms of the history department, it's maybe obviously events such as this that you're organising yourself, Chessie. So I think every year that I've been here for 5 years now, there's been some some events which have been organised through the history department, although slightly I think Heike also has some thoughts on this. There's possibly not been as much involvement with the history department as maybe ideal for Black History Month, but perhaps we shouldn't go too far into those debates. So there is stuff going on. In terms of where the department aligns with the university, it's an interesting question, and it's difficult sometimes to necessarily know precisely what the university's aims are. I think there has been a lot of stuff that's been going off around race recently within the university. So Parveen Yaqub, who's one of the vice chancellors here, one of the sort of co-authors into a sort of report around race in the university. So there's certainly a recognition, I would say, that there are issues that need to be tackled, both in terms of student and student attainment. Reading is still largely a very white university, more white than the British average, and certainly more white than is the average in terms of the sort of local area, in terms of Reading and Slough, it's quite an ethnically diverse area. The university doesn't really reflect that, and that's quite problematic, to be honest. And there's also some quite problematic statistics around the awarding gap, in that we know that Black and Asian students at Reading, as they do at other institutions, tend to be awarded fewer firsts and fewer T1s. And that's actually particularly pronounced, in fact, within arts and social science subjects here. So there is certainly a recognition of those issues. I don't know. There's always the sort of question whether the university will put its money where its mouth is. I'm always thinking of, I'm sure some people here will know the work of the scholar Sarah Ahmed. She's done a lot of sort of critique around sort of university diversity and inclusion initiatives, and the ways in which sometimes that sort of they can become buzzwords, and they can sometimes be used. Sometimes a university will create like a committee around diversity inclusion specifically, so in fact it does not have to tackle issues. It's almost like a fig leaf to say, oh, we're doing something, but in fact they're not. So I'm not saying that's what's happening at the University of Reading, but I think one always has to retain, I think, a sort of radical skepticism towards the ability of bureaucratic processes to actually produce radical change. So I'm excited to see where the university will go next with some of the positive steps that is absolutely taken over the last 18 months. I would really like to see the university actually invest resources and money in diversity inclusion rather than just write reports and have committees. I would really like, for example, the history department to be given money to have a point for a post in Black or in global Black history, which has happened in sort of 20 or 30 institutions in Britain over the last 2 years and has not happened here at Reading. You know, and Emily West has talked about, you know, possibly earmarking PhD funding for a Black or minority ethnic PhD student. So I would love to see some of those resources being allocated towards really helping with this sort of diverse, you know, those sorts of initiatives. So yeah, I feel like I've talked for quite a while now, so I don't know whether we should move on to somewhere else. I don't know if I've actually addressed all of your question, but
no, you have, and we'll come back to some of those points, I think, Natalie. Thank you. That was a really good overview. But you mentioned that Heike might have something to say on this. So Heike, I'll bring you in now if you don't mind. One of the things that we've spoken about a lot, Heike, and within our Africa history group as well, is that actually Black History Month is every month, and it's wonderful to have a time to celebrate it and have this platform, but ultimately the work of Black History Month is every month and it's every week. So my question for you, Heike, is really, what does our history department and specifically the gender cluster do to continue that work beyond the month of October?
And I'm happy to answer that. I just, following from what Natalie said, I think, and I'm not the one in the best position to fill in the details here, but I think some of the things that have been done also need to be celebrated and made more widely, the knowledge about them available. Sorry, I got stuck in that sentence there. Simply because I agree with Natalie, there's much more that needs to be done. And by acknowledging that some things have been done, I think that shows a direction. So Alice has been instrumental in bringing, and Alice, I apologize because I will not remember exactly what it is called, but it's the scholarships for refugees.
Yeah, sanctuary scholarships. They started in September, yeah.
Thank you, Alice. So that's a really important step, but of course it needs to be followed through with more. For the first time, the university, which provides in and of itself, and as Natalie said, we are not different from other similar universities in the United Kingdom. Directly, the university offers very little funding for research students, but a diversity scholarship is now, has been established from this year onwards. But again, there is not that much knowledge about it, and there needs to be more. And the same with the scheme that we are part of in the history department through the AHRC. So in terms of funding and support, yes, I think highlighting what has been done, the change. So I think that's also part of what you planned, you plural, because it was really a student initiative to put this roundtable together, to raise these questions and try to have us all answer them, is to highlight some of the changes and what more can be done. So if you allow me, yes, you asked me about the department and the gender cluster. I'm very much with Natalie on it's a two-sided sword. So I think in the department, we've done really well in many ways in teaching and research, and I'm not going to go over this again. I think our introductions at the beginning to those who are not familiar with us have shown quite clearly that quite a few of us teach Black history from various angles, whether it's Natalie with Black British history, Liz and Emily who are in the room who teach Black US history, I teach African history. We also have, and I think that to me is really important, that we contextualize Black history, that it has to come within a context in and of itself, to a point that one position does not address what needs to be addressed. So yes, we do have two colleagues, one who teaches South Asian history and one who teaches Middle Eastern history. Is that the same as Black history? No, it is not, but it does allow students to have a choice of modules as undergraduates and in the MA, and then as PhD students for supervisors, to be taught and to be supervised on topics from non-Western perspectives. And that is so, so important. Or in the case of Black US history, Black history in the West as well, and Natalie. And I think that's so important. So in research and teaching, I think we're doing really well. Can we always do better? I will definitely, and I have since I joined the department, pitch that, you know, before I joined the department 8 years ago, the university never had an Africanist, a historian of Africa, and we definitely need a second one. You know, it's a world region. Africa is not a country. So it's the only world region that's represented. Anyway, I could go on through that bandwagon. Coming to the gender cluster, I can sing our song, and it's not because I'm paid to do so. I think we've done incredibly well in so many different ways. And this is a very impolite we, but it's because it's all of your work. And mostly the students, sorry, Natalie and Liz. But Liz, you were our student and you did contribute to that as well. And it's so much, but also staff. Emily is in the room, although she's not on the panel today, who supervised amazing Europe projects. These are research projects we offer to our undergraduate students that they can do between their second and third year. And Emily has supervised students to do amazing research on Black US history that now this year result in the second online exhibition. So with not just reach in Reading, but globally, because it's online, has an online platform, which is amazing. We've just had a meeting before this where I'm going to say we are going to have a takeover, which I learned today what that means, that the research cluster will take over for Black history, the university Instagram for a day this month, which again, one can say it's just a day, but it's at least, it's really important. I think it's an acknowledgement of what we're doing, but the range of things from blogs to, I'm not very conversant, as everybody who knows me is aware of, with social media, but all the work that has been done, writing blogs, mostly by students, with amazing reach on our blog web pages for the department, also for the research cluster, the interviews that Shepard and Alice gave last year with so much impact and success. This has really, really had such an, and I don't use it in the narrow term, but an impact by drawing in journalists interested, approaching us, researchers joining us. I think Beth Wilson, who's in the room, our postdoc this year in the gender cluster, who does Black US history. And I should have mentioned her before, I apologize. So she's with us for 3 years. also came across us, I believe, in part through our gender cluster. So it's getting word out there that Black history exists and it has a place in the world. It's not the added on. It's not something that just happens in 1 month. And that leads me to my third, and I promise, final point. And this is the more critical one. This is the accountability point. You know, we've talked a lot about, and I'm not preempting anything you may still want to talk about, decolonization of curricula, being more accountable for Black history, diversity and inclusion. I served for several years on the university committee and was university champion for diversity and inclusion for our School of Humanities. All of that is fine and great, but we all need to be accountable in and of ourselves. I find Robin DiAngelo's work on white fragility inspiring, where she talks about the problematic of being an ally. Both Natalie, I hope you don't mind if I mention that, and I have gratefully accepted being allies to our BAME staff network. But, you know, and here's where the but comes. The burden, I think, these days is not on those of us who actually are Black. It's not the burden on those of us who do Black history. The burden is on those of us who have the pixelation of the skin that I have, or who don't do Black history, and to be accountable for who we are in this world. And as you say, you know, it's with the second wave of Black Lives Matter, the world has changed, and that needs to be an ongoing process. It's like the climate crisis. We can't ignore it. It's there, and it's a question of accountability for each and every one of us as individuals. And I'm not calling for all of us to do Black history. It's for all of us to be accountable in who we are in this world, and that includes in who we are in our research, but in our everyday interactions. And some of that can be really small things, the language we use, the times in any institution, and universities are no exception, one comes across, but it's always been that way, or, oh, let's just laugh about it, it's not that bad. No, it is. Words matter. And we need to scratch at these things as well as do the bigger things. And that's where I personally feel quite some unease about where we are with this, and where I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And to mention the small things, we do, and to some in the audience, it may appear somewhat awkward or odd. We still have boards in the department on the walls where we put up images and writing. And I can't speak for Alice, but I learned from Alice, and I learned from some other students how important it is to have a welcoming, outward facing appearance in a department where it's not just office doors and a name and maybe office hours. Whether we're doing the best we can is another question. But again, to be accountable and say, well, let's show and communicate very clearly who we are. And yeah, I talked for a long time, and I'll close there.
Thank you, Heike. No, I think you've given us a really good overview of the history-wide department activities, and specifically the gender cluster. So thank you for that. But I want to bring in, we've had kind of the university overview, but I'd like to bring in Shepherd for a slightly more personal research experience perspective, if that's okay. Shepherd, you were kind enough to also be interviewed last year about your experiences of belonging and your brilliant research into nationalism and identity in Zimbabwe. Can you tell us about how this past year has been for you? We've talked previously about home for a transient researcher, but I think this year especially that's something worth recognizing. So could you tell us a little bit more about your experiences of research and identity and movement in this past year specifically?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. I think it's it's a multi-layered question, and I'll try my best to answer all the questions. But first of all, I just wanted to start by saying congratulations again to Alice for, lifting up the banner of hope and change in Reading, and congratulations on your election to becoming a councillor. And I wanted to start more on a theme, the theme of celebration. I was at the cinema this past weekend and I watched Time to Die, and I wanted to celebrate Lashana Lynch, who plays the first Black female 007 agent in the franchise Bond. And she does a very, very brilliant job in articulating intelligence, and she's a very opinionated lady, and she's done so great in relation to that character. And I think this time there's real substance in that symbolism, in that it allows a lot of young people, both young and old people, to imagine themselves in those leadership roles, but whether it be in cinema or in our society. So I just wanted to start on that note. I have a former lecturer at Richmond American University who teaches on modern international history, and he uses the Bond franchise in his classes in showing the links between diplomatic history and culture and society, and showing how powerful that franchise is. And so I just wanted to start on that note. On a more personal level, I think my thought process this year has been greatly influenced by Cornel West, who's a African studies professor in the US, and he's written a book called Race Matters, and it's just a classic in race about race relations in America. And he touches on something that's interested me. He said that the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. I know that in our lives, and be it collectively or individually, sometimes we shy away from talking about other people's challenges or sufferings. But people like Alice do it so brilliantly. They talk about refugees and they try to lift up that banner of hope. Sometimes we might not have the moral courage to do those things, but it's very important, like Heike said, in talking about accountability and stuff like that. And so in my own research, that's really, it has really inspired me in articulating myself in my writing, articulating myself in my research, and how I'm accountable to the type of work that I'm doing, not just being one-sided, but trying to find skillful ways to elaborate on, different and pertinent issues that affect our society. And in terms of identity, I said last year, I used the words transient researcher. I think it was purposely done as well, because of course I was going through a transition. I just started my PhD. I felt like, I was just here for a limited, probably a short space of time. But, as I've settled into my PhD, I don't feel that I'm a transient researcher per se. I think if we talk about belonging, it sort of like evolves. It's a process. I think I've settled in, and just being here shows that I think it's testament to the inclusion and the belonging that that we have in this gender cluster history group. And so I don't think I have much to say in relation to my research. And again, my research is on nationalism from a faith and gender perspective, but I don't know if I have any other much personal stuff to share, but I think, that's it for now.
Thank you, Shepherd. No, that was really interesting to hear, especially to look at the journey from our conversation last year as well to now. That's been lovely. One thing that I do want to ask you about, and I would bring in Alice as well if she's happy, although other panel do feel free to jump in, is about this decolonizing the curriculum phrase that we hear a lot in our Africa history group. What do you think that really means and in practice for academics of all disciplines, not just for those of us in history? And how does decolonizing the curriculum play into this celebration theme that we're talking about today? So Shepherd, I don't know if you want to go first on that one.
Yeah, sure. I think decolonizing the curriculum means different things to different people at different stages. When I was at SOAS, it meant a different thing to what it means to me now. I think right now it means inclusion. It means representation. I think we've spoken about representation here earlier on. It means that representation, you know, and I was reading this, I was trying to look at the stats, and I saw that here in the United Kingdom in 2019 and 2020, there was only one Black female history professor in the United Kingdom. And those figures, I know, of course, you know, Black ethnic groups only constitute about 3.3%. That's about just less than 2 million people of, you know, Black ethnic groups here in the United Kingdom. But just having one Black female professor in the United Kingdom is shocking. But I don't know if it's representative of the number of people that are, you know, studying history. But so decolonizing the curriculum means representation. As I said before, when you have people in leading roles or, you know, being professors in a university, it allows young people to imagine themselves in those leadership roles. So I think for me now, decolonizing the curriculum means fair representation, having you know, someone who can represent you in those high places, both culturally and you know, both in terms of heritage, and it also allows inclusion. And yeah, so that's what it means for me at this point in time.
Thank you, Shepherd. Alice, did you have something you wanted to say on that one?
Yes, I just wanted to say, for me, decolonizing the curriculum is more or less bringing all aspects of what we call the global world in any of the research people are doing, so that even if we're researchers, people who read this, even the indigenous people, or let's say I'm researching refugees, they're able to understand and read the material we produce. I found it very difficult for young people when I talk to them during my research, or even the community research that I do. People don't see themselves in everything that we end up writing. So they don't understand some of the things that we do. So I think for me, it starts from there. I know that there is ways of writing that is systematically involving the Western world ideology of writing, which has not accepted any other better way of writing. But there are things that need to be looked into, especially with PhD, because people do go through a very difficult time when it comes to writing PhDs, because they're supposed to be standardized in certain languages, and especially with the contents of words. And also the things that are referenced in PhD or any research needs also to be diverse. It needs, I mean, I wrote an article, a journal recently, is it sometime last year, and went through difficulties writing it because I really wanted to bring in some researchers from Africa and some researchers here in the UK who haven't been quoted in any way, but I like the way they wrote. Some of the reviewers of the material just took me back to the old ones that have always been quoted in and said, you need to bring so-and-so, you need to bring so-and-so into there. For me, I didn't feel that that's decolonizing. As much as universities are talking about decolonizing, that is not being inclusive in the sense that my research relates to those things that are being decolonized. And also decolonizing is not only about writing, it is about the systems that we're into. For example, systems where you find, as we are talking, in geography, like Shepherd said, in the human geography, there are about probably less than 10 professors in human geography. And during the International Geography Association conference this year, one of the Black PhD researchers said, it's like PhD researchers and students who come in, they are quickly made to finish their PhD because they are not wanted in the spaces of academia. And it is very true. Where you walk around at the university, there are certain departments where you don't see even a person. recently the university has found young people also talk about a lot of they don't identify themselves with anybody. Many people don't identify themselves in politics, in offices, let alone in the system at the universities where staff are, not lecturers. You cannot see a diverse staff in offices in any other way except cleaners, security people, people who are busy waiting coffee and doing all these other things, who are essentially very wanted, but they also don't get a living wage. So at the end of the day, where are the representation of decolonizing if we are not going to look at, again, the staffing from the bottom upwards going on? And it's very difficult to look at that and think about decolonizing in the sense of only academic research, but without thinking about the influence and the impact it has on how we teach and how young people want to learn through somebody that they can identify with. Not only being a white, the pigmentation of skin, but it means things that I think the history department talks about, a lot of how you see yourself, how you belong by walking in the corridor there. And you feel, you know what, as much as there are so many white people in history department, I think I belong because they've got those pictures, they've got those things that I feel can be welcoming. So it is that system of trying to decolonize those things and trying to make it much, much better for everybody to be inclusive by making the systems disrupted a little bit. I was in a meeting the other day and somebody said, oh, we need to give it time for people to understand about the decolonization and Black Lives Matter. And I'm looking at it and thinking, I think historians like Liz will support this and say, 401 years, we still need time. I asked, after 401 years, we still need time. For me, there isn't anything more than, if not now, like I talked last year at one of the 7, if not now, when? 401, and people need to understand. And the other thing which I will also bring as a question to the other speakers who come in is, why is it most of the things which have to do with Black people has to be sensitized, politicized, looked with scrutiny, surfaced, even if it's a report, even if it's how you talk, even if everything happens? Why is it always like that? So that we do understand, because young people are asking those questions. Young Black people are asking those seriously questions of how can I belong when everything that I try and do is sensitized, scrutinized. If it's a report, no, it hasn't to be written this way, it will hurt the white person, you have to take out this. But all the time we get those things happening to us, we are supposed to be quiet. One of the books I'm rereading again is Anti-Woman. That book, I'm also reading it again because I feel it is powerful in understanding myself as a Black woman and understanding where all this comes from. Bell Hooks writes quite a lot about that, where it started from, and all searching into the soul of why it is like this in systems. As a Black woman, it has made me see things like you're always told things to do. You're never able to tell other people what to do. And it becomes a very difficult system where you think about belonging and answering those questions. I'm not going to take much of your time, but one of the other documents I read about is from George Day. George Day is Canadian, and I've read some articles that he has written. So he writes specifically on education. And he's a Black Canadian. And he says inclusion is not bringing people into what already exists. It's making a new space and a better space for everyone, for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. I think you put that really beautifully. And I know we'll come back to, well, I hope we'll come back to some of those points that you've raised in questions at the end, but I just want to pick up on that idea of performativity that you raised and go to Liz, specifically about this kind of idea of performative allyship. And there's been lots of discussion about this in the past year about what an ally is and what a real ally does. And I just want to hear your opinion As white researchers of Black history, what does allyship mean for us? How does our work support Black history and Black historians? What's our responsibility and our role in celebrating this Black History Month?
Yeah, thanks, Chessie, and thanks everyone for such fascinating comments so far. Especially Alice, your points there about actually what do we mean when we talk about inclusion? What do we mean when we talk about people belonging? And I think we've all internalized particular notions of what that means. And I think so much of performativity is driven by institutional as well as individual understandings of these terms that are actually very surface level and ill-informed. And something that I think roundtables, forums like this can really push us to think a bit more critically about. And it's great to hear that you feel welcome in the history department, but not so great to hear that that's not the case across the university. And as Natalie points out, there can be as many reports as we like, but ultimately, if people aren't going to take those steps to becoming more inclusive and more welcoming, like what's the point really? In terms of what kind of performative allyship means to me, I think Heike summed it up quite nicely earlier in her references to accountability. I think the flaw when it comes to being a decent person in a position of privilege is acknowledging that you have privilege. That's like that's step one. That's the basics. And that goes beyond simply acknowledging that you have privileges based on, in this context, whiteness, and actually acknowledging that you gain that privilege through the oppression of other people. Whiteness doesn't operate in a neutral space. You are privileged because people who are not deemed white are oppressed. So acknowledging that those privileges you enjoy actually come from something being taken, an opportunity being taken from someone else is part of that accountability. It's part of that recognition that we don't live in a vacuum, that these interpersonal relationships that we seem to think decide whether we are or are not racist actually don't mean a huge amount if you're not going to acknowledge how you come to occupy a position of power in the spaces around you. And I think to avoid simply being performative in that acknowledgement of privilege, we need to be accountable in the other sense that Heike mentioned, which is in those interpersonal relationships, but also acknowledging that we will make mistakes, and we do make mistakes. None of us are perfectly formed kind of anti-racist activists. We still get things wrong. And don't be the classic kind of wounded white person when you do get things wrong and someone points it out. You own up to those things and you say, look, I'm going to try better, and you go away and you try better. And often that involves knowing when to shut up. I think so much performative allyship is just people inserting themselves into conversations where they don't belong, and centering themselves in conversations where they shouldn't be at the center. So it's getting this fine balance between knowing when you should speak up, when you should make use of the privileges you enjoy to help other people, to amplify the voices of other people. And also then just sit back and let someone else make a point. And you know, you just let them have the platform, give them the floor. And I think that's something we saw being a real problem with the Black Lives Matter movement last year, is a lot of well-meaning white people inserted themselves into a conversation that they just didn't need to be involved in. And I come at this as a white historian of racist policing. There was a lot I could have said last year, but I wouldn't be adding anything that couldn't be better said by one of the many, many Black scholars who work on the same issues I do, who can also speak from a position of personal experience that I can't ever speak to. So it's just step back. It's not always your time to shine. But equally, when we have conversations like we are now, you have to be aware that Alice and Shepherd are both postgraduate students, as well as being marginalized in other ways. They are in a position of kind of very limited power within an institution. And at that point, people like me and Heike and Natalie can take the floor and say, we have job security. People listen to us in a different way because we have one hopes, because we have a slightly different title in front of our name, and making use of those privileges to bring these issues to the fore and to kind of advocate for people who might not feel comfortable or secure enough to advocate for themselves. The ultimate in performative allyship was the Black Square thing during the Black Lives Matter protest last year, where people would put a black square on Instagram, and then the following day, they'd be back to like, I don't know, advertising clothing companies that steal designs from Black designers, or just on about their normal business, as if to be anti-racist is to just post a picture one day and then move on with your life. So this is a consistent process. It's not a day, and that's why we need to integrate Black history discussions into the year. This isn't an event. This isn't a moment that we talk about. And I think in terms of my final point here, in terms of decentering, it's increasingly popular, and this isn't a new idea by any means, but it's increasingly popular to acknowledge that all of our oppressions are tied up with each other's. That none of us are free unless all of us are liberated. And to kind of practice what I preach, I guess, Audre Lorde, the classic in that kind of argument. Also for my own, a scholar dear to my heart, Reconstruction, Black feminist from the US, Frances Harper. She did a famous speech at a kind of women's rights convention called "We Were All Bound Up Together." So this is a very old understanding that oppression is linked, and we are all on a joint mission to liberate each other and ourselves. But you can have that understanding and then not make everything about you. And I think for me, as a historian of policing and of race and of women, this has become incredibly clear in the conversation around Wayne Couzens' murder of Sarah Everard. And I know we've heard about this a lot, and it's not something we necessarily want to be hearing about all the time, but white women's responses to that crime, I think, epitomise everything that performative allyship has been. These are the same well-meaning white people who probably have, hashtag BLM in their bios, who support the Black Lives Matter movement, but who still have this conversation about policing as if, people of colour haven't been talking about it for hundreds of years, as if the police are all of a sudden unsafe, whereas before they were safe. And it's just, you're not the heart of this conversation. You've never been the heart of this conversation. Shut up, do some reading, and let other people speak. And on that note, that's what I'm going to do.
Thank you, Liz. I think you put that really, really well. So thank you for raising those points. I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience, but the panel are also invited to ask questions of each other as well. So please just either raise your hand, put it in the chat, or jump straight in if you have something for one of our panelists. Heike, go ahead.
Maybe while people are thinking of questions. Thank you so much, everybody. And Liz, thanks. I don't know whether it was visible. You put a huge smile on my face. And internally, I was saying, yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I think for me, what is really important is it's about the lived experience very much. And again, I mean, you said it brilliantly, but if anybody wants to read up on it, I think, D'Angelo's most recent book, Nice Racism. I think it's called Nice Racism. Yeah, she also, I mean, you put it better than she ever did. But yes, there are a lot of dangers in that. And yeah, decentering oneself is really, really important. So definitely agreement on that. And maybe to add a little bit on that, for me, it's been, as I always say, from the color of my hair, it's easy to guess that I've been around for a while, and other things, wrinkles and so on. But it's always been important to me to strive to have students from the global South, which is, depending on where I've taught on 3 continents, has not always been easy. But I've had the privilege to have research students from Haiti, from Lebanon, from Zimbabwe, from Nigeria. And without going into detail, just the last several days, new recognition of how difficult it can be to settle into being a research student in the UK if you're from the global South, and how differently one is treated compared to somebody who has Western citizenship and otherwise may have the same biography. It is exactly, Liz, as you say, where, I'm more than happy to spend the extra hours it takes to try to help, and both to be a mentor and to be a supervisor, and then try to change the system, which is a lot more difficult than trying to help an individual to actually change the structural circumstances of inequality, but to keep that fight up as well. And one more thing to add, and it's very immodest because I organized it, but I would not have organized it and could not have organized it without my colleagues and you amazing research students last year when the second wave of Black Lives Matter happened. I turned the research seminar that I ran online due to the COVID health crisis into a 23 seminar event on gender and Black history. And it was important, I think, to all of us to recognize that Black lives don't just happen in response to one killing, pivotal as it was, or in 1 month. And it is really, really important to act upon these lines every day. So I'll shut up at this point.
Thank you, Heike. Some really good points raised there. Does anybody else want to jump in? Oh, Alice has got your hand up. Alice, please come on the mic.
Yeah, I probably wanted to ask, as this is a round table, wanted to find out from Natalie or Heike, because I know Liz qualified while I was at university when I started my PhD, but probably both of you have been a little bit working in the university. What I find through research and talking to the community and all that is even the PhD students that are what were the Black researchers is the difficulties of just PhD students getting jobs within the academia. And I need for me to understand, because I'm trying to find this in the aspect of, well, you read, you educate yourself more, but then you align yourself in understanding how the systems work and the institutes, and why is it so difficult when there is so much talent out there? Because many like students, there are not so many PhD students who are Black in our university. Most of the young people that I've talked to who are Black say they don't want to go to PhD because of their experiences in universities. So we are not producing as many PhD researchers who are Black. What can we do? What can is an allyship to make these things of Black Lives Matter or ED work or race equality not just a tick box, make it be felt by the future generations. For us, I'm older, maybe my time has come to pack the bags, but the future generations need that, need to know something, need to feel there's something changing. And they don't want it to wait another 401 years. They want it now. How is it going to happen? Any between you and Natalie and Heike, because Natalie also talked about that quite a lot about the university.
I mean, I think it's a really, it's difficult work, I think, to be honest. And I think, I mean, certainly history, I think the Royal Historical Society report on race revealed the fact that history is the whitest academic subject in the UK in terms of its student body, apart from veterinary science, which is such a shocking statistic, really. And I think it speaks to the need to think about education holistically here, and not just in universities, but also in schools as well. There have been more initiatives within terms of GCSE and A-level curricula to include more Black history there. And actually, for the first time in the last couple of years, I have taught students who have done Black history at school, which never happened to me 5 or 6 years ago. I've never had, students would always say, this is the first time I've ever done this. And that doesn't happen quite so much anymore. So perhaps there are some tentative grounds for feeling mildly encouraged. And I certainly think that even in my 5 years at Reading, I've seen an increase in the amount of Black and ethnic minority students that I think we have as undergraduates in the history department. But of course, we have to think about what we can do as departments and as academics, you know, across the country. And I think, you know, there's lots to be done in terms of thinking about the modules that we offer. I think Heike is right to absolutely say we do reasonably well, to be honest, in Reading. For a small department, we offer more Black history than I would say would be the UK average. I would definitely say that. But there's always, and again, like Heike said, there's always room for improvement. We can always think about more thoroughly about decolonizing the curriculum, and it's just such a buzzword, but it's only certain people, and it's only certain people who talk about it, right? So how do we actually make sure that we're thinking about race? And I know Heike has talked about this a lot in terms of our core modules, where there are places where students have to think about race and nation, but it could be there much more, you know, and really sort of making race a mainstream, it's not something that's not just in, you know, side sort of, oh, you can do Natalie's module in Black Britain, or you can do something with Heike or Emily. It's something that's there present in so many of our modules. I think it's something that we could all really think about doing. But I also think, and well, Alice, you'll be in a much better position to talk about this, and indeed you have talked about this already, about the experience of being a Black student here at Reading, which is a very white university. So thinking about ways in which and it's difficult, for me, I find it quite difficult to think about how this issue can even be approached to make the sort of campus experience and that student experience one which is more representative of I guess Britain's ethnic diversity, and how you can feel less marginalized as a Black student here. And I'm not quite sure how those issues can be tackled really, apart from the fact that we need to have more Black students. But I'm sure there are things, probably having those dialogues with students and thinking about the ways in which we can become more welcoming as a department is an important way forward. But yeah, I don't have any magic solutions, unfortunately. I think there's a lot of hard graft that's involved. And I also think it's unrealistic to think that a university can ever be a sort of utopia of racial equality in a society which is, you know, thoroughly racialized. So, you know, we have to think also beyond the university. And of course, we're in an extremely hostile context really for those sorts of conversations to be happening in higher education, given, you know, the sort of absolute war that the Tory government have, you know, really declared on not just universities, but specifically on critical race theory, on what they like to call wokeness. So, you know, we're operating in a very difficult environment as well, I think. But I don't know whether other people want to come in at this point.
If I can also come in on this. So a few things maybe to add to what Natalie said. I think in addition, what is really one of the things that you said that is really important is, if you look at why are there so few Black professors, history professors, i.e. one, I think two now, with Otele in Bristol. Well, it's exactly important to point out, well, if we don't have a lot of Black history students, then as there is there's a word for this, you know, you need a lot of undergraduates so that
pipeline.
There we are. Thank you, Natalie. The pipeline to who among the undergraduates will actually go on to masters, will go on to a PhD, will then choose an academic career. There needs to be a critical mass to start off with. And part of that, as you raised, is making students comfortable, offering content and decolonizing curriculum, all of that. But part of that, what I would like to add, is also aspiration. And I'm saying something that I think at least some of us in this room are very familiar with, that if you are from a less privileged background, more likely than not, parents will put pressure and say, well, if you have the school qualification to go to study at university, then go and study law, medicine, or go to the business school. Don't do humanities. And it takes quite a bit to convince parents, to convince family, if you're from this kind of background, by which I mean, whether it's economically, whether it's in other ways, less privileged, being perceived less privileged, or actually being less privileged, then it is an uphill struggle to convince yourself, to convince your family that that's the way to go. There's a reason why in the US, for example, the vast majority of African-American historians don't do African history. It's not seen having the same status as US history. It's much more privileged to do US history. So if you do history, then at least you aim for what is seen to have a higher status. So I think that's an important reason to keep in mind. And the other factor, and this is entirely anecdotally, I can say among the students I taught, whether as undergraduates or as master's students or as PhD students who then went on, they all got excellent jobs in the academy. And I mean, you know, Black students I taught. That's anecdotal, but what I can also say, and without breaking confidentiality, is that their university experiences, and I'm not talking about anybody at Reading because I'm not speaking for you, was often very difficult, whether it was in the US where I taught or whether it was when they went on to earn their PhD here in the UK. And that often really discouraged them from considering whether they wanted to actually spend the rest of their professional life in the academy, finding that as a student, they felt marginalized, discriminated against, not heard. And again, I want to acknowledge what Liz said. I don't want to speak for others. It's not my place to do so, but I think it's important to consider that there are career paths and great success that is being achieved, but the choice is usually made before you come to that point. Do I want to be an academic? At least in African history, I can speak to that it's usually the process before. The big name in African history in terms of an African-American woman is Judy Byfield. And there was a reason I brought her into our network for the research seminar last year, and she's gracious, she's amazing, but she's also suffered through the whole thing of being the one African-American woman making the Ivy League as a historian of Africa, doing amazing research, but then also being kind of the poster child and becoming the first Black woman, African-American woman to be the president of the African Studies Association, USA. And I realize we're talking about more than African history here, but all I want to say is the path is there and it's being walked on every day. But the choices are usually made already at school age to say, well, if you can go in a direction that seems to profit the family and you more for your future.
Thank you, Heike. I think we'll formally end there because I know some of our panel have to go, but for anybody that wishes to carry on offline, we'll carry on this particular meeting, is more than welcome to do so. But I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of our panel for this lively, reflective discussion. I know the conversation doesn't end here, so look out for our blogs, social media, there's more to come. But thank you for all of you for your time today.
Thank you.
For organising it,
everyone.
Chessie.
Thanks, everyone.